Tonight, we're going back to New York. Not the version of New York you see in movies, all golden light and taxi horns and grand ambition. We're going to a quieter place than that. A neighborhood in Queens, where the streets told their own version of the American story. One that most people never got to write down. One that most people didn't survive long enough to tell. Welcome to the Sleepy Biographer. Tonight we're going to move slowly through the life of a man named Curtis James Jackson III. You know him by 50 Cent. A name that he chose deliberately, carefully. A name built from the language of the streets he came from. A name that was itself a kind of philosophy. But before the name, there was a boy. And the boy's story begins the way so many of these stories begin. Not with music, not with fame, not with the moment the world finally paid attention. It begins with loss. As you settle in, let your body grow heavy. Let the day's concerns drift to the edges where they belong. We're not in any hurry. This story has been waiting a long time to be told slowly. And slowly is exactly how we're going to tell it. Let's give it the space it deserves. The story of how someone survives is almost never the story they get to tell publicly. The public story is the music, the album sales, the feuds and the lawsuits and the Instagram posts and the Super Bowl appearances. But underneath all of that, earlier than all of that, before any of the noise, there is always a quieter story, a private one, the story of how a person was formed and what that forming cost them, and what they had to become in order to keep going. That's the story we're telling tonight, from the beginning. Curtis was born on July 6, 1975. South Jamaica, Queens. One of the boroughs of New York City that people outside the city rarely think about, and one that people inside the city, at that particular moment in history, were already starting to abandon in their hearts, even if they couldn't afford to leave with their feet. His mother, Sabrina Jackson, was a single parent who supported him by working as a drug dealer. She was 15 years old when she had him. Think about that for a second. 15. Barely done being a child herself, and already raising one alone, in a neighborhood that had very little patience for either of them. Brina, as she was known, sold drugs from an apartment on Old South Road in South Jamaica, Queens, to support him. She was not cruel. She was not reckless in the careless sense of the word. By all accounts, she was fierce, independent, and determined in that exhausting way that single mothers in impossible circumstances tend to be, working the only economy available to her, in a neighborhood that had few legitimate ones. The streets of South Jamaica in the mid-1970s and into the 1980s were not just poor. They were organized around a shadow economy that had its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own logic. During Jackson's early teens, South Jamaica was home to one of the most ruthless and cash-rich gangs, a neighborhood where drugs and guns were openly brandished and millions of dollars collected. The Supreme Team, run by a man named Kenneth Supreme McGriff, controlled crack distribution across large sections of Queens. This was the world that Sabrina navigated alone, with a baby on one hip, and a street reputation she'd built through sheer stubbornness. Sabrina sold drugs independently near these operations. She never sought protection from the larger crews. A brave choice, perhaps, and perhaps a fatal one. Curtis, who people who knew him then called Boo Boo, would have grown up in that apartment, in that neighborhood, surrounded by the particular texture of a life lived at the edge, the smell of a city in the middle of its own slow collapse, the sound of the street below the window, the way that kind of life teaches a child to read rooms, to read people, to become very, very alert to danger, before they are old enough to name what danger actually is. He later told interviewers that his mother was both mother and father to him. She was tough in the way that the circumstances demanded. He described her as someone who wouldn't let him wallow, wouldn't let him be soft in the ways that softness could get you hurt in South Jamaica. She was my mum and my dad, and she was tough, so I didn't know when it was okay to be emotional and when it wasn't. She would look at me on the floor when I was upset and say, "Get up. What are you crying for?" That's the woman who raised him for his first 8 years. Then she was gone. Let that settle for a moment. 8 years old. The world is still mostly formed by the people around you. Your sense of safety, your sense of what's permanent, your understanding of who you are. All of it is still being assembled by the adults in your life. And then the most important one, just isn't there anymore. Sabrina Jackson was murdered when Curtis was 8 years old. The identity of her killer has never been established with certainty. Some accounts describe the circumstances as suspicious. A fire in her apartment, questions about whether she was conscious when it started. The truth, even now, exists mostly in whisper and speculation. What is certain is that she was 23 years old when she died. 23. Her son was 8, and neither of them had been given anything close to enough time. After Sabrina's death, Curtis went to live with his grandparents, where he shared a small house with 8 other relatives. His grandmother, Beulah, took him in. She was the person he would later describe as the one he loved most in the world. In a 2012 interview with Oprah Winfrey, he sat beside her and said it plainly. This woman, this grandmother, was the anchor of his life. But even anchors can't hold everything still. Curtis found solace in his grandparents' basement, admitting later that he was running away from having to deal with people. He couldn't bear to talk about his grief with others. Something closed in him after his mother died. Something that would take decades, if it ever fully opened again. The anger was in there. The grief was in there. And because there was no outlet, no language, no one in that household who knew how to move through loss with a child, the grief just stayed, compressed into something harder, something useful for surviving, something that would eventually, years later, find its way into music. After my mum passed, everything that went wrong because she wasn't there. If I wanted to go to the park, and it would start drizzling, it was happening because my mum wasn't there. That's not a child making excuses. That's a child trying to explain the shape of a world where the center has been removed, and nothing quite makes sense anymore. Everything becomes evidence of the same wound. The drizzle, the torn sneakers, the cousins who got more attention, the nights in the basement, alone. My sneakers would be torn, my clothes dirty, and my skin ashy. The house was crowded, resources were thin, and young Curtis, grieving and invisible in a house full of relatives, was beginning the long, slow drift toward the streets. As you breathe slowly now, think about what it means to be 8 years old and untethered. Not bad, not destined for anything, just alone in a way that doesn't have a word for it yet. Just a kid in a basement in Queens, listening to the sounds of the city and wondering what comes next. The crack epidemic didn't arrive in South Jamaica all at once. It moved through the neighborhood the way most catastrophes move, gradually, and then all at the same time. By the time Curtis was 10, 11, 12, the streets around his grandparents' house had already been transformed. In the 1980s, South Jamaica was an epicenter of the crack epidemic. Highly organized drug gangs made huge profits selling to crack addicts and murdered anyone who got in their way. The murder of a rookie New York police officer named Edward Barn in 1988, shot in cold blood while guarding a witness in South Jamaica, became a national symbol of how badly the city had lost control of its own streets. It was that kind of neighborhood. It was that kind of time. By the age of 12, Curtis was dealing drugs. While telling his grandparents he was at an after-school program. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't even a hardened criminal yet. He was a 12-year-old boy who had grown up watching his mother work the drug trade, who was surrounded by an economy that had only one real entry point for young men, without connections, without money, without the kind of social infrastructure that might have pointed him somewhere else. The after-school program story is almost heartbreaking when you think about it. He was still young enough to lie to his grandmother, still young enough to care what she thought, still young enough to be living in two worlds at once. At weekend parties, his drunken uncles would send the chubby 11-year-old to pick up what they called Fat Alberts, cocaine packed in tinfoil. Deprived of attention and in such close proximity to drugs, he began selling cocaine to his uncles himself. There's a kind of dark logic to it that doesn't feel sensational when you understand the context. This was the world. These were the adults around him. This was what currency looked like. Boxing showed up around this same time. At age 11, Curtis took up boxing to help rebuild his decaying life. At age 14, a neighbor opened a special boxing gym for young prospects. It mattered. The gym gave him structure, discipline, a place where effort produced visible results. He was genuinely good. Some of the adults in his life thought boxing might be the thing, the path out, the skill that carried him somewhere beyond the block. But the streets were faster than the gym. There's something worth sitting with in that sentence, because boxing and the drug trade are not opposites. Not really. Both reward pain tolerance. Both punish hesitation. Both teach you that the difference between winning and losing is often just who quits first. What the gym couldn't offer, what it could never offer, for a boy without money, without a father, without anyone to cover the gap between ambition and opportunity, was cash. Now, tonight, the corner didn't make you wait to get paid. By his mid-teens, he was embedded in the drug trade in the way that most teenagers get embedded in anything, gradually, and then completely. Arrest came when he was 16. Weapons possession. Arrested at 16 for weapons possession. A boot camp turned him away from selling drugs. A correctional facility. 7 months. The kind of pause that changes some people and fails to change others. For Curtis, it was somewhere in between. He came out. He started taking rap more seriously. The two things, the street life and the music, would run parallel for a few more years before one of them finally consumed the other. But that collision point was still coming. First, there was more living to do, more surviving. He was operating in one of the most dangerous drug environments in American history, in a neighborhood where the rules were enforced not by courts, but by the men who ran the corners. He knew who they were. They knew who he was. In a neighborhood that small, that organized, everybody knew everybody. He took his stage name from Kelvin Martin, a 1980s Brooklyn robber known as 50 Cent. The name was a metaphor for change, but it also signaled a certain kind of relentless, opportunistic survivalism. That choice of name, that particular piece of self-invention, tells you something important about how his mind was already working. He wasn't just surviving. He was building a persona. He was thinking about what it meant to be known, to be feared, to be remembered. The street had taught him those things mattered. Let yourself drift a little now. The city outside your window is quiet. Somewhere in Queens, on a street that looks different today than it did in the late 1980s, a boy was learning the rules of a world that most people never have to know. Not because he wanted those rules, because those rules were already there when he arrived. It's easy, in retrospect, to draw a straight line from Curtis Jackson the street kid to 50 Cent the rapper, as if there was always a plan, as if the music was always inevitable. It wasn't. It came in sideways, the way most real things do, not as a grand revelation, but as a slow realization that something he was doing, something he'd been doing almost without noticing, was actually good, that it resonated, that people responded. Jam Master Jay from the breakthrough rap group Run DMC met 50 Cent in 1996 and began mentoring him. This was a significant moment. Jam Master Jay was not a peripheral figure. He was a founding architect of hip-hop, one of the men who had taken rap from the Bronx block parties of the late 1970s and pushed it toward mainstream American culture. For him to hear something in a 20-year-old from South Jamaica, to invest time and attention in that voice, it meant something. It meant that what Curtis was doing with words wasn't just good for a kid from the neighborhood, it was actually good. Hip-hop in the mid-1990s was in a particular kind of fever. The East Coast-West Coast rivalry had reached its most dangerous point. Tupac and the notorious B.I.G. were still alive, still at the center of the most commercially explosive moment in rap history. And the music felt electric and dangerous and alive, in a way that it had never quite been before, and would never quite be again. A young man from Queens who'd grown up in proximity to that world, who'd absorbed its language and its rhythms, who'd carried real stories in his body. He had something to offer that a studio rapper couldn't manufacture. The contrast that Curtis was living in those years was genuinely strange when you think about it. By day, or rather, by night, by corner, by the invisible economy of South Jamaica, he was doing the things that the drug trade required. And in some other part of himself, some quieter inner room, he was building a different kind of voice, writing, rhyming, practicing the art of compression that hip-hop demands, taking a complicated experience and finding the exact 6 or 8 or 16 bars that made another person feel it in their chest. He was learning that words could do what fists couldn't, that a line could travel further than a corner could hold you. The influences were everywhere. Queens had produced a particular strand of hip-hop, thoughtful, cinematic, lyrically dense. Nas from Queensbridge had proven that you could make an entire world out of a neighborhood. That specificity was power. Mobb Deep, also from Queens, had found a way to make the particular terror and claustrophobia of street life into art that felt universal. These were not distant role models. These were men from nearby streets, making music that sounded like home. Curtis absorbed all of it. He had an ear for structure, for the way a hook works, for the exact moment when a verse needs to land hard, and the exact moment when it can afford to breathe. These things are difficult to teach. You either feel them or you don't. He felt them. By the late 1990s, he had signed his first major deal. By 1999, the rapper had signed a deal with Columbia Records. He was slated to release his debut album, Power of the Dollar, under the label. A debut album, a real one, with major label support and real production, and the possibility, the actual, tangible possibility, of becoming someone whose music reached people outside of Queens, outside of New York, outside of the world that had formed him. He was 24 years old. He had survived his childhood. He had survived the streets. He was standing at the edge of something that looked, for the first time in his life, like a door opening rather than closing. And then, May 24th, 2000, arrived. It was a Tuesday. He was sitting in a car outside his grandmother's house, the same house in South Jamaica where he'd lived since he was 8 years old, the same street where his grandmother had taken him in, fed him, kept him as safe as anyone could keep a child in that particular geography and that particular era. Outside his grandmother's house in South Jamaica, Queens, New York, on May 24th, 2000, 50 Cent was ambushed. A gunman approached the car. 9 shots. Not 1, not 2, 9. Bullets pierced his hand, arm, hip, both legs, chest, and face, which resulted in a dimple scar and a slight change to his speech. That became part of his vocal signature. He later described the experience in a way that is worth sitting with. You don't actually feel each one hit you. The adrenaline is pumping. You moving and trying to get out of the way. I was bouncing around the back seat. 9 bullets. And he was still in the back seat of that car, still moving, still trying to get out of the way. His grandmother witnessed the attack from her home. Think about that for a moment. The woman who had raised him since he was 8 years old, who had taken him in after his mother died, who had been the one constant adult presence in his life. She saw it happen. From a window or a doorway or a porch, she watched her grandson get shot 9 times, in the street outside her home. He made it to the hospital, barely. 13 days in the hospital, multiple surgeries, and a painstaking recovery process that included physical therapy, a workout regimen, and initial dependence on a walker, marked his journey back to health. It took about 5 months, but he emerged not just alive, but reborn. The bullet in his cheek left permanent physical marks, a slight alteration to the shape of his face, a subtle change in the way he spoke. That speech pattern, that barely there slur, became part of his sound. His voice would carry the evidence of that day for the rest of his career. Who ordered the shooting? This question has been discussed and analyzed for decades. The identified shooter, Darryl "Homo" Baum, an associate of Mike Tyson, met his own violent end 3 weeks later. Drug kingpin Kenneth "Supreme" McGriff was alleged to have ordered the hit, a claim supported by testimony in later court proceedings. McGriff is serving a life sentence in prison. There is a possibility, debated but not dismissed, that the shooting was connected to a song. The track Ghetto Quran has been speculated to be a reason for the shooting, because it named real people from the South Jamaica drug world by name. In hip-hop, that kind of specificity carries consequences. Curtis knew this. He'd grown up in that world. He knew the rules, and yet he named names anyway. Whether that's what brought the gunman to that car on that Tuesday, no one can say for certain. What we know is that Kenneth McGriff, the man who'd run the Supreme team, the man who had once operated in the same streets where Sabrina Jackson sold drugs alone without seeking protection, ended up serving a life sentence. And Curtis James Jackson III survived 9 bullets and went on to become one of the most famous men in American music. The physical recovery was painful, methodical, and real. 50 Cent had to relearn how to walk properly because of the bullets that hit his legs. He worked with physical therapists to regain his strength and mobility. The bullet wound in his cheek required speech therapy to help him speak clearly again. But the mental and emotional recovery, that's harder to chart. He told Oprah in 2012 that the trauma changed him, pushed him toward aggression, built walls that were already tall, even taller. After I got shot 9 times at close range and didn't die, I started to think that I must have a purpose in life. How much more damage could that shell have done? Purpose. That's the word he used. Not luck, not miracle. Purpose. As if the 9 bullets were not an ending, but a kind of violent confirmation that he was supposed to be alive, supposed to do something with the life that had somehow not been taken from him on a Tuesday in May. And then, almost immediately, the professional ground shifted beneath him. As soon as you're fine, the doctor's telling you you're going to recover. You look and you go, well, what am I going to do? The record company's not answering the phone anymore. Everything's changing. And then it's like, you got to figure out how to do it on your own. Rest here for a moment. Just breathe. 9 bullets. 13 days in the hospital. A grandmother watching from a doorway. And then, while the body is still healing, the phone stops ringing. That's the story. Not the famous version. Not the cleaned up version. That's what actually happened. Rebuilding from nothing. Columbia Records dropped him. The shooting incident spurred Columbia Records to drop him from a record deal and shelve his first album, Power of the Dollar, the album he'd spent years building toward, the debut that was supposed to announce him to the world, simply disappeared, not released, not shelved with any promise of future release, just gone. The label moved on. He was a liability now. A man who had been shot 9 times outside his grandmother's house was not, in the calculus of a major record label, a safe commercial bet. So he had nothing. No label, no album, healing bones and learning to walk again, and a body full of hardware, and a grandmother who had watched him almost die in the street. 24 years old, in a neighborhood that had already claimed the lives of most of the people he'd grown up with. Most people would have stopped there, not because they were weak, because that is a genuinely catastrophic series of events, and the rational response to a genuinely catastrophic series of events is to pause, to recalibrate, to consider whether the path you are on is worth continuing. Curtis did not pause. While in the hospital recovering from his wounds, he had been dropped from his Columbia deal, turning him back into the streets and providing him with a renewed sense of hustle. During that time, he recorded mixtapes, 50 Cent is the Future, No Mercy, No Fear, and God's Plan, all of which featured Lloyd Banks and Tony Yayo from his newly formed group G-Unit. G-Unit. The name alone was a declaration. He wasn't going to disappear. He wasn't going to accept the verdict that the industry had handed him. He was going to build his own thing, his own crew, his own infrastructure. And he was going to put it directly into the hands of the people who were most likely to respond to it. The mixtape model he used was not new exactly. DJS had been circulating bootleg compilations for years. But what Curtis did with it was different. He flooded the streets. He used instrumentals from popular songs, beats that people already knew, beats that were already in heavy rotation on radio, and he rapped over them with a ferocity and specificity that felt genuinely urgent, not polished, not radio-ready, real. Whereas few artists ventured outside of the major label system to build buzz, the rapper overcame getting dropped by Columbia Records and recovering from 9 gunshot wounds to architect a career in the streets. He took a mixtape model and bent it to his advantage, using instrumentals from popular songs to create classic releases, like 50 Cent is the Future and No Mercy, No Fear, with his G-Unit crew. The mixtape spread. not through industry channels, not through radio promotion or publicists, or any of the machinery that the music business usually relies on. Through the street, through trunk sales, through the particular word-of-mouth economy that has always operated beneath and alongside the official music industry, faster, more honest, and far more loyal. There's an irony worth noticing here. The industry had dropped him because he was a liability, and he responded by going around the industry entirely, building an audience the industry couldn't reach, using channels the industry didn't control, in a language the industry hadn't approved. By the time the major labels understood what had happened, the audience was already his. The industry didn't discover 50 Cent. The streets did. The industry just wrote the check. Guess who's back? The project that caught Eminem's ear sold 800,000 copies by way of Landspeed Records. 800,000 copies of a mixtape, without a major label, without a radio campaign, without anything except the music and the story and the streets doing what streets do when something resonates. Eminem heard it. He played it for Dr. Dre. And then everything changed. In the other direction this time. After being dropped from Columbia Records, 50 Cent doubled down by forming G-Unit and releasing a string of mixtapes and projects that caught the ear of Eminem. That cosign ultimately led to his signing with Dr. Dre's Aftermath Entertainment. The cosign from Eminem and Dre was not just a business transaction. In the hierarchy of hip-hop in the early 2000s, their approval was one of the most valuable things in music. Eminem had just finished the most dominant commercial run in rap history. Dre had built two of the most important labels the genre had ever produced. Their combined credibility was essentially the highest possible endorsement that the world of rap could offer. And they were giving it to a man who had been shot 9 times and dropped by his label and spent 2 years rebuilding from absolute zero. Let yourself settle deeper into wherever you are right now. The night is quiet. The story is still moving. But rest in this moment for just a second. The image of a man who had every reason to stop and simply didn't. Sitting in a makeshift studio somewhere in Queens, recording over other people's beats, building something from nothing, refusing to disappear. The Rise of a Star. February 6th, 2003. That's the date. Write it down somewhere in your memory. Or don't. It's the kind of date that tends to stick on its own. Get Rich or Die Tryin was released on February 6th, 2003 by Interscope Records, Dr. Dre's Aftermath Entertainment, Eminem's Shady Records, and 50 Cent's G-Unit Records. The debut single was In Da Club, and within days of its release, it was impossible to go anywhere in America and not hear it. Clubs, cars, radios, the loop of that synth, the particular swagger of the delivery. It felt like it had always existed, like it had been waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. The album debuted atop the Billboard 200 with a staggering 872,000 copies sold and held the #1 position for 6 weeks. 6 weeks at #1, with a debut album from a man who 3 years earlier had been left for dead by a gunman and by his label. The album topped the charts in the US and Canada, while reaching #2 in the UK. It sold 12 million copies in 2003 alone, while being certified 9 times platinum in the US and 4 times platinum in the UK. That makes it one of the most popular hip-hop albums in history. 9 times platinum, 12 million copies in a single year. These are numbers that don't feel real when you say them out loud, and yet they're what happened. In a year when the music industry was already beginning to feel the first tremors of digital disruption, when CD sales were starting their long decline, this album moved 12 million physical copies in 12 months. Get Rich or Die Tryin was nominated for Best Rap Album at the 46th Grammy Awards. Rolling Stone ranked it number 280 on their updated 500 Greatest Albums of All Time list. The cultural impact went beyond the charts. This was not just a successful album. It was a shift in what mainstream hip-hop sounded like, in what the public was willing to receive, in the relationship between authenticity and commerce. That rap had always had to navigate carefully. 50 Cent had swagger and charisma, talked tough but had a penchant for humor and hooks. He had a successful run in the New York hip-hop scene, where he redefined mixtapes for a new generation of artists. The second single, 21 Questions, showed something different, a tenderness almost beneath the armor. A man asking whether someone would still love him if he lost everything, given what he'd already lost and rebuilt. The question didn't feel hypothetical. It felt like it came from somewhere real, and the public responded to that realness. PIMP followed. Then If I Can't. Each single doing what great singles do, arriving with a different mood, a different texture, demonstrating range without abandoning the core identity. That had made people pay attention in the first place. 9 months after Get Rich or Die Tryin', G-Unit released their group album Beg for Mercy. It debuted at number 1 as well. The crew that Curtis had assembled during the lean years, Lloyd Banks, Tony Yayo, Young Buck, were now all chart-topping artists operating under his banner. He bought a house in Connecticut, the former home of Mike Tyson, purchased for $4.1 million, a 52,000 square foot estate. From a basement in Queens to the largest private residence in the state of Connecticut in about 3 years. That trajectory doesn't have many historical parallels in the music industry or anywhere else. And through all of it, the sales, the awards, the celebrity, the tabloid coverage, the music kept the evidence of where he came from. He wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. He was performing exactly what he was, with exactly the intensity that his life had given him. That alignment between the art and the life was part of what made the audience trust him, part of what made the music last. Beyond music, here's something that gets lost in the 50 Cent story when it's told quickly. Something that matters more in some ways than the record sales. He understood very early that music was a platform and not a ceiling. The industry he'd fought so hard to enter, the industry that had dropped him after the shooting, that he'd had to rebuild his way back into from absolute zero. He didn't trust it completely. He admired it. He operated within it. He dominated it. But he didn't bet everything on it. He kept his eyes open for other doors. Vitamin Water's endorsement was one of 50 Cent's most significant financial successes. Unlike conventional endorsement offers, wherein celebrities are paid a flat charge, 50 Cent opted for a stake in the company. That distinction, flat fee versus equity stake, is where the financial intelligence lives. Most artists offered a deal to be the face of a beverage brand would take the cash. It's immediate. It's guaranteed. It doesn't require you to understand anything about business or markets, or the difference between short-term and long-term thinking. Curtis said no to the cash. He took the ownership stake instead. When Coca-Cola acquired Vitamin Water's parent company Glasso in 2007 for $4.1 billion, 50 Cent earned an estimated $100 million after taxes from his minority stake. $100 million from a beverage company, because instead of accepting the conventional deal, he thought differently about what he was being offered. The Vitamin Water deal became a kind of template, not just for him, for an entire generation of artists who looked at that transaction and understood that the real asset wasn't the music. It was the attention, the audience, the cultural gravity that certain artists develop. That gravity, properly applied, was worth more than any recording contract. 50 Cent often prioritizes equity stakes over flat fees in his business deals. This strategy has paid off significantly, as seen with the vitamin water deal. He also self-finances projects like his Final Lap tour, which allows him to reap higher returns by assuming more risk. The television work was another evolution. Power, the Star's drama about a New York drug kingpin, navigating the line between the street world and legitimate business, ran for 6 seasons and became one of the most watched shows on premium cable. His deal with Starz became reportedly worth as much as $150 million, showcasing his capacity to move his reputation into lucrative business ventures. Power worked because it was essentially a high-budget version of the story Curtis had been telling all along. The tension between the street and the legitimate world, the costs of ambition, the impossibility of completely escaping where you came from. He didn't just produce the show, he understood it from the inside, because he'd lived a version of it. The show spawned multiple spin-offs. Power Book 2, Ghost, Power Book 3, Raising Kanan, Power Book 4, Force, BMF, each one building on the world he'd created, generating new revenue, new audiences, new distribution deals. A franchise built from a story about a drug dealer trying to go straight, full circle in the most literal possible sense. He also retained ownership and creative control of G-Unit Records, the label he founded in 2003. He founded G-Unit Film and Television, which has produced content across multiple streaming platforms. His spirits company, Sire Spirits, producing premium cognac and champagne under the Branson and Le Chemin du Roi labels, developed multi-year partnerships with NBA teams, including the Sacramento Kings, Houston Rockets, and Indiana Pacers. Another equity play, another bet on ownership over endorsement. He told Forbes at one point that he earns between $900,000 and $1 million per concert performance, without having released an album since 2014. Think about what that means. He built a machine that generates income independent of new music. The music opened the door. The business held it open. Breathe slowly. The night is quiet. Think about what it means to learn business in a neighborhood where the only business education available was watching drug crews operate, where the economics of supply and demand were taught, not in classrooms, but on corners. In a strange, dark way, South Jamaica gave him the instincts. The music gave him the platform, and the platform gave him everything else. Fame has a particular kind of friction that most people don't talk about honestly. It's not just the pressure, though there is enormous pressure. It's the speed of it. The way that one year you are selling mixtapes out of car trunks in Queens, and the next year you can't walk through an airport. The way that the world, which had absolutely no interest in who you were 12 months ago, is now interested in everything. What you're wearing, who you're sleeping with, what you said at a club at 2 in the morning, what the expression on your face means in a photograph taken without your knowledge. You don't get a manual for that. There is no transition period where someone prepares you. One day the door is closed, and then one day it isn't, and you're just supposed to know how to live on the other side. Curtis Jackson went from counting mixtape sales to sitting across from Jay Leno in the span of about 3 months. Get Rich or Die Tryin was released in February of 2003. By spring, he was everywhere. By summer, he was inescapable. By the end of that year, he had sold 12 million albums, been photographed with everyone from Bono to Mike Tyson, been written about in publications that had never bothered to learn what South Jamaica, Queens actually looked like. He was 27 years old. and he had spent the previous 2 decades learning a very specific set of skills. How to read a room for danger, how to project strength at all times, because in the world he'd come from, any crack in the armor was an invitation. How to never show need, how to never show softness, how to keep every relationship transactional enough that when it ended, and it always ended, you weren't destroyed by it. These were survival tools, tools that had kept him alive, literally, in a neighborhood that had killed most of the people he'd grown up with. But they were terrible tools for fame. Let yourself imagine it for a moment. Not the glamorous version, the actual version. You are 27 years old, and you have spent your entire life being told, by circumstance, if not by words, that you are not worth much, that South Jamaica is not a neighborhood the world cares about, that your grief is inconvenient, and your anger is dangerous, and your ambition is presumptuous. You have been shot 9 times and abandoned by your label, and you have spent 2 years rebuilding from nothing. And then, suddenly, the world cares about all of it. Not about you, about the story of you, about the version of you that fits on a magazine cover, or a television screen, or a radio soundbite. The version that is interesting rather than complicated. The version that has a clean narrative arc. Hard childhood, street life, near death, triumph. The version that doesn't require anybody to sit with the messiness of what actually happened. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with that kind of visibility. Not the loneliness of being unknown. He'd had plenty of that. But the loneliness of being seen as a symbol instead of a person. Of watching the world construct a version of you and being unable to correct it because the correction is too complicated, too human, too far from what anyone came here for. He was performing 50 Cent, and 50 Cent was performing exactly what the world wanted from him. And somewhere underneath all of that, Curtis Jackson was still there, the kid from the basement, the boy who ran away from grief, the man who had learned to compress everything he felt into something harder and more useful. That's who was living inside all of that fame. And he was not, by all accounts, doing particularly well. The pressure existed at every level simultaneously. There was the commercial pressure first. Get Rich or Die Tryin had sold 12 million copies. That is not a number you can simply follow up on. That is a number that redefines expectations permanently. Every journalist who interviewed him, every executive who called his manager, every fan who showed up to a show, all of them carrying that number in their heads. 12 million. Can he do it again? Will he do it again? The bar had been set by himself, in the best possible moment, under the most favorable possible circumstances. And now every subsequent piece of work would be measured against it. There was the physical pressure. The body was still healing in ways that didn't show. The bullet in his cheek had rearranged the architecture of his face. The bullets in his legs had changed how he moved. He had gotten very good at not showing any of this. The workout regimen, the physique, these were part of the performance too. I am not damaged. I am stronger. I survived, and the surviving made me more. But the body remembers things the performance can't entirely cover. And there was the pressure of the world he had come from, watching. South Jamaica was watching. The streets were watching. The people who had known him before, who remembered him as Curtis, as Boo Boo, as the kid with the grandmother who wouldn't let him cry. They were watching. And there is a particular weight to that kind of observation. The people from your neighborhood watch you succeed, with a complicated mix of pride and scrutiny, and something that isn't quite jealousy, but lives next door to it. They're looking to see if you'll forget where you came from, They're looking to see if you'll remember too loudly and embarrass everyone. They're watching to see if you'll be real or whether the fame will hollow you out. He knew they were watching. That knowledge never left him. The feud with Ja Rule, which had begun in 1999 before the shooting, before the album, before any of this. It became the defining beef of early 2000s hip-hop, and it tells you something important about the psychology underneath the fame. On the surface, the feud was about the music, about whose version of New York was more real, about authenticity and territory, and the invisible borders that hip-hop had always drawn and then argued about. But underneath the surface, it was something older than any of that. In the world Curtis had come from, your reputation was not a marketing asset. It was your life. The people who had enforced the rules in South Jamaica hadn't done so with lawyers or cease and desist letters. They'd done so with presence, with force, with the unambiguous communication of where the lines were and what happened when you crossed them. Backing down from a challenge, even a verbal one, even a musical one, meant something that went beyond strategy. It meant you were weak. And being weak in that world had consequences. He pursued the feud with Ja Rule the way he'd learned to pursue anything that threatened him, completely, methodically, not just to win, but to dismantle, track by track, interview by interview, public appearance by public appearance, until there was no question about who had won, and no ambiguity about the outcome. He didn't just compete, he eliminated. This is not a personality trait. It's a learned response. It's what you develop when you've grown up in a world where conflict doesn't resolve itself. You resolve it, fully and finally, or you live with its consequences indefinitely. The music industry is not South Jamaica. The rules are different. The stakes are different. But the man operating within the music industry had been built in South Jamaica, and the instincts don't update just because the context changes. The game was inducted into G Unit, and for a while the crew was a juggernaut. But the game's refusal to participate in 50 Cent's other feuds, with Fat Joe, with Jadakiss, created exactly the kind of internal tension that these crews were always vulnerable to. The dismissal came in March 2005, on air, public, final. No negotiation, no middle ground. The same instinct that had destroyed Ja Rule's commercial standing, now turned inward, towards someone who had been a brother 18 months earlier. That's what the fame was doing to the relationships, compressing them, making them brittle, turning every disagreement into a loyalty test that, once failed, couldn't be undone. The world inside the G Unit operation in 2003 and 2004 and 2005 was genuinely strange. These were men who had known each other from nothing, from corners, from studios that weren't really studios, from the particular intimacy of making something together when nobody cared about what you were making. And now they were on tour buses and private planes and in arenas, with security and assistance and an entire infrastructure that had materialized around them almost overnight. Lloyd Banks, Tony Yayo, Young Buck, men who had built with him. There is a particular thing that sudden wealth and sudden celebrity does to a group of people who came up together. It reveals the math that was always there, who actually has the leverage, whose name is on the contract, who was a partner, and who, it turns out, was an employee. These revelations are not comfortable. They are especially not comfortable when the people involved grew up in a world where being someone's employee, being beholden to someone else's decisions, was something you fought your entire life not to be. He held the power. He had built the machine. His name was the brand. And that reality, as it settled in over months and years, changed the texture of every relationship within it. Some of those relationships survived. Some of them didn't. The transition from rapper to businessman was not a clean pivot. It was more like a slow revelation of what he'd actually been doing all along. The vitamin water deal in 2004 is where this becomes visible. He was offered money to be the face of the brand. He said no to the money and asked for equity instead. That choice, the choice to own something rather than simply be paid for his attention, is not a choice most people in his position would have made. The cash is certain. The equity is a bet. And you only make that bet if you understand at some level that your cultural gravity is worth more than anyone is offering you. Where did that understanding come from? South Jamaica. Where else? He'd grown up watching how the street economy actually worked. Not the corner level, the ownership level. The men who survived, the men who built something that lasted, were not the ones moving product. They were the ones who owned the distribution, the territory, the infrastructure. They were the ones who understood that the real money was never in the labor. It was in the leverage. He'd absorbed that lesson at 12, in the only classroom available to him, and he was applying it in a completely different arena, 20 years later. The vitamin water stake earned him an estimated $100 million when Coca-Cola acquired the parent company in 2007. That number transformed what was possible, not just financially, conceptually. He now knew what it looked like to apply his cultural platform to ownership instead of endorsement. He knew the difference in the outcome. Power, the Star's drama, was built from the same logic. He wasn't just an actor or a producer. He was a creative architect who retained meaningful ownership in the franchise he built, and then used it to build more. Power Book 2, Raising Kanan, Force, BMF. Each spin-off generating new audiences, new revenue, new creative control. The music had been the proof of concept. The business was the application. And quietly, in the spaces between the feuds and the legal battles and the tabloid coverage, he was becoming something the streets of South Jamaica had never produced. Not a rich man. There had been rich men in South Jamaica. Kenneth McGriff had been rich. The Supreme Team had been rich. But they'd been rich inside a closed system. Their wealth stayed within the world that generated it, and eventually that world consumed them. Curtis was becoming rich inside a different system, one where his name opened doors that had nothing to do with where he was from, one where the platform could keep compounding, as long as he kept refusing to be finished. Let yourself rest here for a moment. The night is quiet. The story is almost done. Think about what was happening in those years, 2003, 2004, 2005, in that strange compressed space where everything was possible, and everything was also fragile. A man carrying everything South Jamaica had given him: the grief, the instincts, the armor, the intelligence, the refusal to yield, into a world that had never been designed for him, navigating it with tools built for a completely different kind of survival, making decisions that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes catastrophic, and sometimes both simultaneously. The cost of success is not a simple thing. It's not just money spent on lawyers, though that was real. $24 million in legal fees across his career. It's not just relationships broken by the politics of a crew worth too much money, though that was real too. It's not just the feuds that went on longer than they should have, that burned bridges that didn't need burning, that spent energy on war when the energy was needed elsewhere. The cost was also internal. The compression of everything he felt, for years, into something harder and more useful. The management of a persona that was consuming more and more of the person underneath it. The loneliness of being visible in a way that had almost nothing to do with being known. He did not fall apart under any of this. That is genuinely remarkable. He was not a man who collapsed. He reorganized. He recalibrated. He filed for bankruptcy and paid off the judgment faster than anyone expected. He lost feuds he shouldn't have picked and won ones that cost him too much and kept going either way. The same qualities that made him formidable on the way up became more complicated at the top. The aggression that had served him so well on the way up. The willingness to go to war over reputation, to refuse to yield on anything, found fewer and fewer productive targets. And the intelligence that had built the machine was increasingly occupied with managing the damage that the aggression created. That's the tension that runs through this whole era of his life. Two things, equally real, pulling in opposite directions. The man who had built one of the most remarkable careers in the history of American music, and the cost of being built the way he was built in order to do it. As you breathe slowly, let yourself sit with the complexity of that. There's no clean lesson here. There's just a life, complicated and real, and still, somehow, continuing. So what do we make of him? What is the shape of this story, when you step back far enough to see it whole? Curtis James Jackson III was born to a 15-year-old drug dealer in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America, at one of the most dangerous moments in that neighborhood's history. He lost his mother at 8. He lost his way into the drug trade at 12. He survived being shot 9 times at 24. He was abandoned by his first label and rebuilt his career from mixtapes sold out of car trunks. He reached the summit of the music industry and then watched some of that summit crumble beneath him through a combination of bad legal decisions, expensive feuds, and the particular kind of recklessness that sometimes accompanies sudden enormous wealth. And then he built again. What made him different? Part of it was the voice. Not just the literal voice, though that mattered. The slight slur, the particular delivery, the way he could make a line land with exactly the right amount of weight. But the larger voice, the artistic identity, was something else. He was not performing a street character. He was a street character who had learned to perform. That difference is everything in a genre that has always been exquisitely attuned to authenticity. Part of it was the intelligence, the vitamin water deal, the television empire, the equity over fee philosophy. These are not the moves of someone who got lucky and stumbled into wealth. These are the moves of someone who was paying close attention, who understood leverage, who had learned in a very hard school that you don't survive by being naive about what you're worth. Part of it was the stubbornness, dropped by his label, bankruptcy. Each time, he simply refused to accept that the story was over. The refusal had limits. It cost him relationships, money, credibility in some arenas. But it also kept him alive, professionally and literally, when most other people would have stopped. This was not a studio gangster, a musician who makes up stories about drugs, violence, and murder in order to sell records. He grew up on the streets of New York, survived an assassination attempt, and used those experiences to fuel his songs. There's a difference between art that borrows its texture from real life and art that is made of real life. The best of his music lives in that second category. And here's what makes that rare, genuinely rare, not just in hip-hop but in any art form. Most people who experience the kind of life Curtis Jackson experienced don't get to make anything from it. They're consumed by it. The ones who escape usually do so by leaving it behind, by deliberately not bringing it with them into whatever comes next. What Curtis did was the opposite. He carried it. He built a career from the weight of it. He turned what should have been baggage into the entire architecture of what he made. The audience could feel that it cost him something real, and that cost is exactly what they were paying for. And here's what's worth thinking about. At the end of this long night, as your breathing slows and the story settles around you, the thing that fascinates people about Curtis Jackson, the thing that has kept them interested for more than 2 decades, long after the peak of the commercial success, long after the radio saturation, long after the moment when he was everywhere at once, is not the fame. It's the survival. We are drawn to people who have refused to be finished, who have taken the worst that the world could offer and turned it into something. Not cleanly, not without cost, not as a lesson or a blueprint or an inspiration necessarily, just as evidence. Evidence that the line between where you start and where you end is not as fixed as it appears from the outside. He grew up in a house with 8 people and no money, and a grief he couldn't speak. He built one of the largest entertainment empires in hip-hop history, not because the path was clear, not because someone opened the door, because he kept pushing on every door he could find until one of them opened. South Jamaica, Queens is a different neighborhood now. The crack epidemic that shaped Curtis's childhood has been replaced by other crises, other pressures, other kinds of quiet desperation that the city generates in its poorest corners. The corner where his grandmother's house stood, the same house where she watched him get shot, the same house where he'd lived since he was 8 years old, and his mother didn't come home. That corner has seen things that would fill a dozen more sleepy biographies. But this particular story, the one that began with a boy in a basement and a mother who didn't come home, this one ended somewhere his mother could never have imagined for him, somewhere that most people in South Jamaica in 1975 would not have considered a possible destination. Not because the world made room for him, because he refused to let it not. And so, as the night wraps itself around you, as your breathing finds its own slow rhythm and the thoughts grow soft at their edges, rest in this. The story of Curtis Jackson is not a simple story. It is not a story that arrives at a clean moral or points neatly toward a lesson. It's a story full of real blood and real loss and real mistakes and real brilliance and real stubbornness and real reinvention. A story that carries the weight of every child raised without enough, without safety, without permanence, without the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the adults in your life have things handled. It's a story about the crack epidemic, about what New York looked like when its neighborhoods were left to manage their own catastrophes, with no real help from anywhere. About what a child does when the most important adult in his life is killed before she turns 24, and nobody explains why, and life is just supposed to continue, as if that's manageable, as if grief is a thing that gets put in a drawer somewhere, and you move forward. It's a story about music as survival technology, not music as art, not at first, as survival. The way that language, when compressed into rhythm and made into something people could carry around in their heads, could give a person from South Jamaica, Queens, a way to be seen, a way to matter to people who had never driven through his neighborhood, and never would. The mixtapes weren't about ambition in the beginning. They were about existence. I am here. I survived. Listen. History is not always made in grand places. Sometimes it is made in a cramped house in Queens, in a basement where a grieving child is trying to figure out what comes next. Sometimes it is made in a car outside a grandmother's house, in the moment after 9 bullets that somehow failed to finish what they started. Sometimes it is made in a hospital room, where a man is relearning to walk, while his record label is quietly erasing him from their plans. Sometimes the people who shape the culture are the ones who had the least reason to believe they ever would. The world has a way of writing off certain kinds of people before they even have a chance to show what they are. The neighborhood writes you off. The system writes you off. The record label writes you off. And every single time Curtis Jackson was written off, he responded not with a public statement, or a plea, or an explanation, but with work, with another mixtape, with another deal, with another refusal to accept someone else's final verdict on what his life was worth. That's the thing. That's what people who look at this story from the outside sometimes miss. The resilience was not inspirational in the performance of strength sense. It was just consistent, grinding, unglamorous. He made music in studios nobody had heard of. He sold mixtapes out of trunks. He went to physical therapy when his body was wrecked, and then went back to the recording booth. He filed for bankruptcy, and then paid off the judgment faster than the court expected. There was no one single moment of triumph. There was just continued refusal to quit. Whether you find him sympathetic or complicated or difficult, or all of the above, and he is genuinely all of the above, the fact of his persistence, through genuinely impossible circumstances, is not in dispute. That persistence is real. The cost was real. The reconstruction, each time, was real. South Jamaica, Queens is a different neighborhood now. The crack epidemic that shaped Curtis's childhood has been replaced by other crises. The Supreme Team is long gone. Kenneth McGriff is in federal prison for life. Darrell Baum, the man who pulled the trigger in May 2000, was dead within 3 weeks of the shooting. Jam Master Jay, who had mentored a young Curtis in 1996, was shot and killed in his recording studio in Queens in 2002, a murder that remained unsolved for nearly 2 decades. The world that formed Curtis Jackson kept consuming people, and he kept not being consumed. The corner where his grandmother's house stood, the same house where she watched him get shot, the same house where he'd lived since he was 8 years old, and his mother didn't come home. That corner has seen things. That would fill a dozen more sleepy biographies, dozens of stories that never got written down, because the people living them didn't survive long enough to tell them. But this particular story, the one that began with a boy in a basement and a mother who didn't come home, this one ended somewhere his mother could never have imagined for him. Somewhere that most people in South Jamaica in 1975 would not have considered a possible destination. Not because the world made room for him, because he refused to let it not. As your eyes grow heavy, and the night settles in fully around you, carry just this with you. Resilience is not pretty. It doesn't look the way they show it in movies. It looks like a man in a hospital bed, making plans for the next mixtape, while his body is still learning to function again. It looks like bad decisions, and expensive feuds, and a bankruptcy filing. At the same time, the Instagram page shows piles of cash. It looks like a grandmother watching from a doorway, and a boy deciding, somehow, to keep going. It looks like all of that, messy and complicated, and real. If tonight's story reached you, and you'd like to find your way back to this channel, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps other people find their way here, to this quiet hour, to these long, slow walks through lives that were anything but quiet, one sleepy listener at a time. Sleep gently, dream softly, and let the night carry you the rest of the way. Good night.